Welcome to another segment of Down and Dirty. I'm Jim Martin with the Charleston Parks Conservancy, and today we're going to talk about one of the most exciting plants to work with, succulents. Now it's time to dish the dirt. Today we're going to be playing with some succulents that are a little mean. So we're going to make sure we've got a pair of handy gloves to keep us protected. And you notice with this little agave here how it's got some spines on it, so we'll need these gloves. Here I am at one of my favorite places to buy fantastic plants for the garden, Hyams Garden Center in Charleston, South Carolina. And they've been nice to allow us in today to look at some of the marvelous selections of succulents that they have to choose from. And if you look down this table, you're going to be amazed at exactly what you have at your fingertips these days, which in the last 10 to 15 years has markedly improved variety-wise from what we used to be able to play with in the garden. So when we think about color, we usually think about flowers. But with the succulents, there's a lot of color choices to choose from that are very exciting in containers. One in particular that I'm very fond of is this echeveria called Pearl von Nürnberg. And look how beautiful that pinkish color, a little bit of the blue mixed in with it. And you know, when you're looking at these succulents, you can use this plant as a color palette to work the rest of your container with, and we'll see that a little bit later on. While color is always a factor to consider when you're choosing these plants, one of the other things that I look for is the kind of textures in the succulents that you find. And here's a good example of two plants that have some similar colors going on, and you notice a little bit of the burgundy in the tips. And this is a succulent called Kalanchoe Flapjack, and it's a very coarse, big texture compared to the echeveria that we have here, which a little bit finer, but notice the coloration in that foliage. So I would describe this plant as a little bit more of a medium texture compared to the texture of this flapjack. Before I touch the first plant, I choose my container. And as you can see before you, there's a bunch of color out there. When it comes to container gardening, the only limiting factor is your imagination. So when you're walking through one of those stores and you see something hanging from the wall and you think, that's not very pretty, think twice. There's all kinds of things you can do with these less than beautiful containers that are out there to choose from. A good example is this wire basket. What is it that we could do by using this, combining it with an aloe and this sedum to come up with something that you'd want to hang in your garden? The succulents we're talking about today like well-drained soil. So the mix that we're going to put together is going to have to allow that to happen, especially here in the South where we have a lot of rainfall sometimes in the summer months. If you've got too heavy of a mix that holds water, many of these succulents will rot. So what I start out with is sort of a 50-50 mix. 50% of a soilless mix that you can get at any local garden center or big box store. And then I use a product called Permatil. Permatil is a very porous stone material, and what it does is it allows the water to move rapidly through the soil. So I put that in there. We're going to mix it up, and then we're ready to go. So when you're starting with a drab container, add some color. Out and about the other day, I found these fantastic felted garlands. So wait till you see what we do with these with our container planting. So here we have the finished containers. Look at that color pop. So let's look at the plants that we put in here again. Here is that singular aloe, which has a little bit of that orangish, if you look at it closely, a little bit of the orange on the tips to sort of tie that color echo into the orange that we've sprayed the container. In the base, we planted the donkey tail, and that over time will flow out of the container over the sides. And then planted thirdly this echeveria within the actual container itself, slitting a little hole and sticking the plant through there before we actually fill in the soil. Then to finish the container off, we've added these fun felted pieces of the garland that we tore apart and just hot glued onto the containers. So again, for a very inexpensive container, you can add a huge color pop to a space, and instead of doing just one, do 3. So whenever I decide to plant the container, I look at my major plant, the one thing that I want to stick out in that container. And here it's this aloe, and it's a rather big aloe. And the thing that I liked about it to begin with is that as it grew, the leaves below died off, and so I cut that off. And what it does now is it has this nice stem, and so it has some height on it. So I chose that as my major container plant. And then I chose a bunch of things to go on the base level. And you can see that I just didn't do one of this, one of this, one of this. I did groupings, so that you can almost see there's a line of groupings here. First you have this sort of burgundy line, another line with this donkey tail, and then another little aloe here that sort of fills out the bottom of the container underneath this aloe on the top. Also notice that there's some really good color within those different succulents, so that it adds some interest to the entire planting. And while varying the colors can add to some very exciting container plantings, as we see with this is really all the same color. It's blue. But notice the different textures. The aloe is the coarsest. The senecio is a much smaller texture than this. And then we have this little ground cover here that has the teeniest of textures. And together, it's a very pleasing effect. As you've seen in this segment, succulents are a fun group of plants to play with. At the same time, there are exciting things that you can do in your garden with these plants. A few things to remember though. Choose your container first. Work with some of the wonderful colors and even pull your color scheme off of the container that you're using. Tip number 2, come up with a plan and then stick with it. Here we have 2 different containers with sort of 2 different things going on. This one was all about color, and we sort of carried through with that through the entire container. And then this one over here, not so much about color, it was more about texture, and we varied it in a wonderful way. So for impact, follow the plan. Tip number 3, let's have fun. You can take a container like this, add a little color, and before you know it, ta-da! Thanks for joining me for another segment of Down and Dirty. I'm Jim Martin with the Charleston Parks Conservancy, Park Angel number 11. I hope you've enjoyed this segment about succulents. There's some wonderful things out there for us to try in our gardens. Learn more about succulents and all the other wonderful things out there to do at charlestonparksconservancy.org in our resource section. You'll find wonderful tips and watch more videos.